I'm David Hoffman, filmmaker, and you're about to see a clip from my 6-part PBS television series, Making Sense of the 60s, circa 1991. So it's a long time ago that I made this, and an even longer time ago that I'm looking at. I'm looking at the 1960s. I'm looking at middle-class, largely white, suburban kids in the new suburbia. I came from Levittown, Long Island, one of those suburbias. There had been a PBS series called Eyes on the Prize, which looked at the black civil rights era experience. So PBS gave me a grant to make a series on the largely white suburban middle class. And what I'm trying to explain is why so many kids, not all, rebelled against the 1950s. I know it's very controversial now. My God, if you look at the comments on my previous baby boomer clips, holy moly, people hate the baby boomers, people think it messed up the world. People think it messed up America. That is another subject. What I'm looking at in this clip is what it was like that caused kids to rebel. And I, after a lot of study, came up with these unwritten rules. The rules are very important to understand because all of us felt these rules. These rules were like written in stone, but they were in fact never really spoken. You just sort of felt you had to live by them. And one of the things I'm proud of is that I use these educational films. Let me just tell you, they're not easy to get. We saw them in high school. 16 millimeter, guy comes in with the audiovisual guy, comes in, sets up the projector, and they ran these films. Well, for us, in my classes at least, and the classes of others that I spoke with, nobody believed these films. These films were like fantasies. They were Hollywood fantasies. Looked at from the present, well, I don't know what you think, but looked at from the late 1980s, we could all look at these old films and say, yeah, that's what I was rebelling against. It wasn't like that. None of us lived like that. And also remember, the baby boomers break into at least, this is being debated on my YouTube channel, 3 groups. One group didn't participate in the 60s at all, lived in small towns, rural America, or just wasn't part of it, didn't look at it that way. Another group rebelled, grew their hair longer, smoked marijuana, wear a hippie-like outfit, although no way were they hippies, listen to rock and roll. And a third group, a very small group, were political activists, really radicals. But that may be less than 5% of the population. So it divides into these 3 groups. About 35% of the baby boom generation say they participated in the 60s. The group that was political radicals, less than 5%. The others, maybe 65%, who didn't really participate in the 60s. Some of them did in the 70s, and some of them did in the 80s, but in the 60s, we're looking at this large segment of largely suburban, largely white kids. And I can guarantee you among that group, almost all of us, them, felt uncomfortable. You could say kids always feel uncomfortable as teenagers. True, but this particular period was strange. What the society was telling us was not what we were seeing. It was like radically different. There was no truth. There was no, even more important than the YouTube world, authenticity to what people were saying. They weren't living the lives and doing the things they were telling us to do. That is what this clip is about. 1989, interviews with people considering what they did back in the 60s and trying to explain it to younger generations.
This boy and girl coming home from school look quite content with life. They're looking forward to an important date, dinner at home with the family.
Though they seem artificial today, educational films like this one, which were shown to school children all over America, accurately reflect the attitudes and values of white middle-class society in the 1950s, when real-life documentaries were few and far between.
Doesn't that sound exciting to you?
Their purpose was to teach kids the proper way to behave and to repeat and reinforce a set of rules.
The rules were things you talked about on the telephone with your friends, and they were imposed by your parents. Parents talked about it a lot. There were high school counselors who told you what the rules were, and even if they weren't written down, everybody really knew, and you could almost read them out, cite them. And I think looking back on it from the 60s, what people did in the 60s was self-consciously break every damn one of them.
The women of this family seem to feel that they owe it to the men of the family to look relaxed, rested, and attractive at dinner time. Brother notices the time and realizes that he must put things in order and clean himself up in time for dinner.
What were the rules? One of them was obey authority. Don't ask questions. In the 60s, millions of young people would renounce that one.
These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. This is the time for pleasant discussion in a thoroughly relaxed mood. They don't pick this time of the day to spring unpleasant surprises on Dad.
We are molding our boys the way we feel they should be molded in the 50s. I think you have to start molding right away when they're just infants. And so that was our influence. We tried to make this a very influential time, a constructive time, through Boy Scouts, through church, through Cub Scouts, through Little League, or not Little League, but the little pony leagues or whatever they had, you know, these little kids. It was awfully cute. Yeah, they were fun times with our kids, with our boys. We had a great time.
Let father and mother guide the conversational trend if they desire. After all, they made all this possible.
My impression of that time was that a child was to be seen and not heard, and that we were never allowed to express anything that was negative. We were never allowed to talk back in any way, even to question why should I do something or could I do it later. We weren't treated as if we were people. We were another species.
Another rule, control your emotions. In the 60s, masses of baby boomers would reverse this one and, quote, let it all hang out.
Oh, I'm so happy. I could be a model. Or a cover girl.
Hey, what's gotten into that crazy kid's sister?
Oh, Jeff, don't be that way.
Notice how Mother seems to become angry herself because of Jeff's anger. Perhaps she shouldn't, but anger is a violent emotion, and we often see an induction of behavior or spread of emotion to other persons, almost like a contagious disease.
If you misbehaved, you weren't normal. And the idea of normal is a kind of vegetative state where nothing happens. But that's what everybody tried to aspire to. But I think it's a word that people are constantly using to exhort you to behave better. Why don't you be normal? It's not normal to wear your hair long. It's not normal to wear Levi's. It's not normal to listen to rock and roll. It's not normal to read comic books. There's a whole list of a million things that everybody does that isn't normal.
Well, what makes you think they look at your clothes?
Oh, because the other fellas wear sweaters or just shirts, not a regular suit like mine.
Well, wear a sweater then.
Another rule, fit in with the group. Don't stand out. Conform in your actions and your appearance. In the 60s, great numbers of young people would, quote, do their own thing.
Pick out the most popular boys and girls in school and keep an eye on them. Try to figure out why people like them. Not that you'll ever be just like any of them, but you might learn something. Well, see you at dinner.
Many young people found these restrictions painfully repressive, but they struggled to obey them anyhow because if they didn't, they knew there'd be unpleasant consequences from society or from their peers.
Yoo-hoo!
Jenny thinks that she has the key to popularity, parking in cars with the boys at night. When Jerry brags about taking Ginny out, he learns that she dates all the boys. What about Ginny? Does that make her really popular? Do the boys and girls like her? Is she welcome to join this group?
Hi, Betty, Ellie. You can rest your tray here, Ginny, for a minute. Thanks. Say, Wally, how's the play coming along?
Oh, okay, Jenny. Here, Jenny.
No,
Thanks,
girls
Jerry.
who park in cars are not really popular. Not even with the boys they park with. Not when they meet at school or elsewhere.
Nothing like being Miss Popularity. Yeah.
I think that there was this sense that, yeah, well, sure, they're using sex to be popular now, but, you know, what about in the future? They're going to be, like, thrown on the rubbish pile. And I think that did happen, because I think that boys did maintain an attitude of, you know, they wanted to get laid, but they wanted to marry a virgin.
Jeff, isn't that Eileen?
It sure is. Baby and all.
Gee, I haven't seen her since she left school.
And maybe this was the biggest rule of all. Don't even think about having sex. In the 60s, young people all over the country would proclaim, if it feels good, do it.
Mary, wait, please. Sorry, Mary.
In the height of emotion, it's not always easy to stop and think things through. But if you'll just slow down the rush and pressure of your feelings a little, then judgment has a better chance to take hold and guide you away from wrong behavior.
It was sort of a nightmare. Looking from the outside, I'm sure it didn't seem that way to observer, but for me, I felt so lonely. I was popular, and I didn't have those problems. I wasn't a nerd or anything like that, but there just wasn't anybody from my planet, is the way that I kind of described it. I felt like I had so much bottled up inside of me.
Most kids trying to behave properly did keep it all bottled up inside. But a minuscule number began to rebel. It was a preview of coming attractions.
What startles me when I look back at my yearbook photos now, they all look so old. Everybody looks so old. I mean, they look like little adults. You know, they don't, it's startling to me how old, how already getting into the groove all of these people look with their flat top crew cuts. And then every so often, you know, you turn the page and you see the guy with the ducktail. And you know, here's the rebel.
Being a rebel by slicking your hair back and wearing a black leather jacket seems harmless now. But in the 1950s, many adults saw this as the first sign of teenagers going bad.
Many teenagers are as concerned as their parents with the public's conception of today's youth. These students are portraying what we consider bad taste in school attire and behavior. This student is wearing an extremely tight skirt.
Improper dress was an innocent way to defy adult restrictions. But a growing number of young people were turning against society's rules in more significant ways. Some were inspired by the beatniks, a small but conspicuous group of young adults in the big cities who dabbled in marijuana, wrote poetry, and won scores of imitators in high schools all over the country.
Cellophane wrapped in the black nightmare of the endless factory.
My soul squeezed in the hydraulic press of eternal drip, drip, drip.
We started, a bunch of us, putting out a poetry magazine, and suddenly it was banned because of one little poem. And so we had our first publication suppressed, and the poem I still remember to this day was, "I'd like to kiss just left of center of the valley of her breasts, and then I'd try the other side," or something. Anyhow, so they banned the magazine, and we went outrageous.
The banning of, quote, unacceptable ideas provoked certain politically aware students to begin questioning the values, the motives, and the judgment of school officials and others in authority.
And then one day, the principal came into the class and had us all pass up our copies of Catcher in the Rye and told us to forget that we'd ever seen this book. We learned fairly quickly that the book had been banned by the school board. This turned out to be a real learning experience for all of us, because we learned a lot more than we would have learned if we'd just been allowed to read the book. Because this way, of course, not only did we read the book, but everybody in the school suddenly wanted to read the book.
I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it provocative. Some of you will hate the people in it and hate what they say, and some of you won't. I know that from the comments. But what I wanted to do by presenting this was kind of explore the time frame that I grew up in and that I made a lot of movies in, documentaries, of course, interviewed a ton of people, looked at again. I know, and I've made other clips on this, that there were some terrible errors made by those who participated in the 60s. But I also know that there were some changes that had to be made. Those of you who say, let's go back to the 50s, well, you know, we can't do that. The era has changed. Some aspects of the 50s I'd like to see returned, and you would also. Others can't go back. We're in a different world. Others won't go back because America's a different place. I hope this is interesting, and I hope that you continue to watch my documentary clips and me trying to give some story and color and flavor to what you're seeing. Patreon is the way to support me, www.patreon.com/allinaday. I don't love asking for money, but I need it. Thank you.